Wind tugging at my sleeve, feet sinking into the sand. I stand at the edge where earth touches ocean, where the two overlap, a gentle coming together. At other times and places, a violent clash. Across the border in Mexico, stark silhouette of houses gutted by waves. Cliffs crumbling into the sea, silver waves, marbled with spume, gashing a hole under the border fence. Miro el mar atacar, la cerca en Borderfield Park, con sus buchones de agua, an Easter Sunday resurrection of the brown blood in my veins. Oigo el llorido del mar, el respiro del aire. My heart surges to the beat of the sea, in the gray haze of the sun. The gull's shrill cry of hunger, the tangy smell of the sea seeping into me. I walk through the hole in the fence to the other side. Under my fingers, I feel the gritty wire, rusted by 139 years of the salty breath of the sea. Beneath the iron sky, Mexican children kick their soccer ball across, run after it, entering the U.S. I press my hand to the steel curtain, chain link fence crowned with rolled barbed wire. Rippling from the sea where Tijuana touches San Diego, and rolling over mountains and plains and deserts. This tortilla curtain turning into El Rio Grande, flowing down to the flatlands of the Magic Valley of South Texas, its mouth emptying into the Gulf. 1,950-mile-long open wound, dividing a pueblo, a culture, running down the length of my body. Staking fence rods in my flesh, splits me. Me raja. This is my home. This thin edge of barbed wire. But the skin of the earth is seamless. The sea cannot be fenced. El mar does not stop at borders to show the white man what she thought of his arrogance. Yemayáa blew that wire fence down. This land was Mexican once, was Indian always, and is, and will be again. Yo soy un puente tendido, del mundo gabacho al del mojado. Lo pasado me estira para atrás y lo presente para adelante. Que la Virgen de Guadalupe me cuide. Ay, 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 soy mexicana de este lado. The U.S.-Mexican border es una herida abierta, where the third world grades against the first and bleeds. And before a scab forms, it hemorrhages again. The lifeblood of two worlds merging to form a third country, a border culture. Borders are set up to define the places that are safe and unsafe, to distinguish us from them. A border is a dividing line, a narrow strip along a steep edge. A borderland is a vague and undetermined place created by the emotional residue of an unnatural boundary. It is in a constant state of transition. The prohibited and forbidden are its inhabitants. Los atravesados live here. The squint-eyed, the perverse, the queer, the troublesome, the mongrel, the mulatto, the half-breed, the half-dead. In short, those who cross over, pass over, or go through the confines of the normal. Gringos in the U.S. Southwest consider the inhabitants of the borderlands transgressors, aliens, whether they possess documents or not, whether they're Chicanos, Indians, or Blacks. Do not enter. Trespassers will be raped, maimed, strangled, gassed, shot. The only legitimate inhabitants are those in power, the whites and those who align themselves with whites. Tension grips the inhabitants of the borderlands like a virus. Ambivalence and unrest reside there, and death is no stranger. In the fields, la migra. My aunt saying, no corran, don't run. They'll think you're del otro lado. In the confusion, Pedro ran, terrified of being caught. He couldn't speak English, couldn't tell them he was fifth-generation American. Sin papeles, he did not carry his birth certificate to work in the fields. La migra took him away while we watched. Se lo llevaron. He tried to smile when he looked back at us, to raise his fist. But I saw the shame pushing his head down. I saw the terrible weight of shame hunch his shoulders. They deported him to Guadalajara by plane. The furthest he'd ever been to Mexico was Reynosa, a small border town opposite Hidalgo, Texas, not far from McAllen. Pedro walked all the way to the valley. Se lo llevaron sin un centavo al pobre. Se vino andando desde Guadalajara. During the original peopling of the Americas, the first inhabitants migrated across the Bering Straits and walked south across the continent. The oldest evidence of humankind in the U.S., the Chicanos' ancient Indian ancestors, was found in Texas and has been dated to 35,000 BC. In the southwest United States, archaeologists have found 20,000-year-old campsites of the Indians who migrated through or permanently occupied the southwest Aztlán, land of the herons, land of whiteness, the Edenic place of origin of the Azteca. In 1000 BC, descendants of the original Cochise people migrated into what is now Mexico and Central America and became the direct ancestors of many of the Mexican people. The Cochise culture of the Southwest is the parent culture of the Aztecs. The Uto-Aztecan languages stem from the language of the Cochise people. The Aztec, the Nahuatl word for people of Aztlán, left the Southwest in 1168 AD. Now let us go. Tihueque, tihueque, vámonos, vámonos, un pájaro cantó. Con sus 8 tribus salieron de la cueva del origen. Los aztecas siguieron al dios Huitzilopochtli. Huitzilopochtli, the god of war, guided them to the place that later became Mexico City, where an eagle with a writhing serpent in its beak perched on a cactus. The eagle symbolizes the spirit as the Son, the Father. The serpent symbolizes the soul as the earth, the mother. Together, they symbolize the struggle between the spiritual celestial male and the underworld earth feminine. The symbolic sacrifice of the serpent to the higher masculine powers indicates that the patriarchal order had already vanquished the feminine and matriarchal order in pre-Columbian America. At the beginning of the 16th century, the Spaniards and Hernán Cortés invaded Mexico and, with the help of tribes that the Aztecs had subjugated, conquered it. Before the conquest, there were 25 million Indian people in Mexico and the Yucatan. Immediately after the conquest, the Indian population had been reduced to under 7 million. By 1650, only 1.5 million pure-blooded Indians remained. The mestizos, who were genetically equipped to survive smallpox, measles, and typhus, old world diseases to which the natives had no immunity, founded a new hybrid race and inherited Central and South America. En 1521 nació una nueva raza, el mestizo, el mexicano, people of mixed Indian and Spanish blood, a race that had never existed before. Chicanos, Mexican Americans, are the offspring of those first matings. Our Spanish, Indian, and mestizo ancestors explored and settled parts of the U.S. Southwest as early as the 16th century. For every gold-hungry conquistador and soul-hungry missionary who came north from Mexico, 10 to 20 Indians and mestizos went along as porters or in other capacities. For the Indians, this constituted a return to the place of origin, Aztlán, thus making Chicanos originally and secondarily indigenous to the Southwest. Indians and mestizos from central Mexico intermarried with North American Indians. The continual intermarriage between Mexican and American Indians and Spaniards formed an even greater mestizaje. El destierro, the lost land. Entonces corre la sangre, no sabe el indio qué hacer. Le van a quitar su tierra, la tiene que defender. El indio se cae muerto y el afuerino de pie. Levántate, Manquilev. Arauco tiene una pena más negra que su chamal. Ya no son los españoles los que le hacen llorar. Hoy son los propios chilenos los que le quitan su pan. Levántate, Pailawan. Violeta Parra, poema Arauco tiene una pena. In the 1800s, Anglos migrated illegally into Texas, which was then part of Mexico, in greater and greater numbers, and gradually drove the Tejanos, native Texans of Mexican descent, from their lands, committing all manners of atrocities against them. Their illegal invasion forced Mexico to fight a war to keep its Texas territory. The Battle of the Alamo, in which the Mexican forces vanquished the whites, became, for the whites, the symbol for the cowardly and villainous character of the Mexicans. It became, and still is, a symbol that legitimized the white imperialist takeover. With the capture of Santa Ana later in 1836, Texas became a republic. Tejanos lost their land and overnight became the foreigners. Ya la mitad del terreno les vendió el traidor Santa Ana, con lo que se ha hecho muy rica la nación americana. ¿Que acaso no se conforman con el oro de las minas? Ustedes muy elegantes y aquí nosotros en ruinas. From the Mexican Corrido del peligro de la intervención. In 1846, the U.S. incited Mexico to war. U.S. troops invaded and occupied Mexico, forcing her to give up almost half of her nation, what is now Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, Colorado, and California. With the victory of the U.S. forces over the Mexican in the U.S.-Mexican War, los norteamericanos pushed the Texas border down 100 miles from El Río Nueces to El Río Grande. South Texas ceased to be part of the Mexican state of Tamaulipas. Separated from Mexico, the native Mexican Texan no longer looked toward Mexico as home. The Southwest became our homeland once more. The border fence that divides the Mexican people was born on February 2nd, 1848, with the signing of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. It left 100,000 Mexican citizens on this side, annexed by conquest along with the land. The land established by the treaty as belonging to Mexicans was soon swindled away from its owners. The treaty was never honored, and restitution to this day has never been made. A poem by William H. Wharton. The justice and benevolence of God will forbid that Texas should again become a howling wilderness, trod only by savages, or benighted by the ignorance and superstition, the anarchy and rapine of Mexican misrule. The Anglo-American race are destined to be forever the proprietors of this land of promise and fulfillment. Their laws will govern it. Their learning will enlighten it. Their enterprise will improve it. Their flocks range its boundless pastures. For them, its fertile land will yield luxuriant harvests. The wilderness of Texas has been redeemed by Anglo-American blood and enterprise. The gringo, locked into the fiction of white superiority, seized complete political power, stripping Indians and Mexicans of their land while their feet were still rooted in it. Con el destierro y el exilio, fuimos desuñados, destroncados, destripados. We were jerked out by the roots, truncated, disemboweled, dispossessed, and separated from our identity and our history. Many, under the threat of Anglo-terrorism, abandoned homes and ranches and went to Mexico. Some stayed and protested, but as the courts, law enforcement officials, and government officials not only ignored their pleas, but penalized them for their efforts. Tejanos had no other recourse but armed retaliation. After Mexican-American resistors robbed a train in Brownsville, Texas on October 18, 1915, Anglo-vigilante groups began lynching Chicanos. Texas Rangers would take them into the brush and shoot them. 100 Chicanos were killed in a matter of months. Whole families lynched. Several thousand fled to Mexico, leaving their small ranches and farms. The Anglos, afraid of the Mexicanos, would seek independence from the U.S., brought in 20,000 army troops to put an end to the social protest movement in South Texas. Race hatred had finally fomented into an all-out war. My grandmother lost all her cattle. They stole her land. Drought hit South Texas, my mother tells me. La tierra se puso bien seca y los animales comenzaron a morirse de sed. Mi papá se murió de un heart attack, dejando a mamá pregnant y con 8 huercos, with 8 kids and 1 on the way. Yo fui la mayor, tenía 10 años. The next year, the drought continued y el ganado got hoof and mouth. Se cayeron in droves en las pastas y el brushland, panzas blancas ballooning to the skies. El siguiente año, still no rain. Mi pobre madre, viuda, perdió 2/3 of her ganado. A smart gabacho lawyer took the land away. Mamá hadn't paid taxes. No hablaba inglés. She didn't know how to ask for time to raise the money. My father's mother, Mama Locha, also lost her terreno. For a while, we got $12.50 a year for the mineral rights of 6 acres of cemetery, all that was left of the ancestral lands. Mama Locha had asked that we bury her there beside her husband. El cementerio estaba cercado, but there was a fence around the cemetery, chained and padlocked by the ranch owners of the surrounding land. We couldn't even get in to visit the graves, much less bury her there. Today it is still padlocked. The sign reads, "Keep out. Trespassers will be shot." In the 1930s, after Anglo agribusiness corporations cheated the small Chicano landowners of their land, the corporations hired gangs of Mexicanos to pull out the brush, chaparral, and cactus and to irrigate the desert. The land they toiled over had once belonged to many of them, or had been used communally by them. Later, the Anglos brought in huge machines and root plows and had the Mexicans scrape the land clean of natural vegetation. In my childhood, I saw the end of dry land farming. I witnessed the land cleared, saw the huge pipes connected to underwater sources sticking up in the air. As children, we'd go fishing in some of those canals when they were full and hunt for snakes in them when they were dry. In the 1950s, I saw the land cut up into thousands of neat rectangles and squares, constantly being irrigated. In the 340-day growth season, the seeds of any kind of fruit or vegetable had only to be stuck in the ground in order to grow. More big land corporations came in and bought up the remaining land. To make a living, my father became a sharecropper. Rio Farms Incorporated loaned him seed money and living expenses. At harvest time, my father repaid the loan and forked over 40% of the earnings. Sometimes we earned less than we owed, but always the corporations fared well. Some had major holdings in vegetable trucking, livestock auctions, and cotton gins. Altogether, we lived on 3 successive Rio farms. The second was adjacent to the King Ranch and included a dairy farm. The third was a chicken farm. I remember the white feathers of 3,000 leghorn chickens blanketing the land for acres around. My sister, mother, and I cleaned, weighed, and packaged eggs. For years afterwards, I couldn't stomach the sight of an egg. I remember my mother attending some of the meetings sponsored by well-meaning whites from Rio Farms. They talked about good nutrition, health, and held huge barbecues. The only thing salvaged for my family from those years are modern techniques of food canning and a food-stained book they printed made up of recipes from Rio Farm's Mexican women. How proud my mother was to have her recipe for enchiladas coloradas in a book. El cruzar del mojado, illegal crossing. Ahora sí ya tengo una tumba para llorar, dice Conchita, upon being reunited with her unknown mother just before the mother dies. From Ismael Rodríguez's film, Nosotros los Pobres. La crisis. Los gringos had not stopped at the border. By the end of the 19th century, powerful landowners in Mexico, in partnership with U.S. colonizing companies, had dispossessed millions of Indians of their lands. Currently, Mexico and her 80 million citizens are almost completely dependent on the U.S. market. The Mexican government and wealthy growers are in partnership with such American conglomerates as American Motors, IT&T, and DuPont, which own factories called maquiladoras. 1/4 of all Mexicans work at maquiladoras. Most are young women. Next to oil, maquiladoras are Mexico's second greatest source of US dollars. Working 8 to 12 hours a day to wire in backup lights of US autos or solder minuscule wires in TV sets is not the Mexican way. While the women are in the maquiladoras, the children are left on their own. Many roam the street, become part of cholo gangs. The infusion of the values of the white culture, coupled with the exploitation by that culture, is changing the Mexican way of life. The devaluation of the peso and Mexico's dependency on the U.S. have brought on what the Mexicans call la crisis. No hay trabajo. Half of the Mexican people are unemployed. In the U.S., a man or woman can make 8 times what they can in Mexico. By March 1987, 1,088 pesos were worth $1 US. I remember when I was growing up in Texas, how we'd cross the border at Reynosa or Progreso to buy sugar or medicines when the dollar was worth 8 pesos and 50 centavos. La travesía. For many Mexicanos del otro lado, the choice is to stay in Mexico and starve or move north and live. Dicen que cada mexicano siempre sueña de la conquista en los brazos de 4 gringas rubias, la conquista del país poderoso del norte, los Estados Unidos. En cada chicano y mexicano vive el mito del tesoro territorial perdido. North Americans call this return to the homeland the silent invasion. A la cueva volverán. El Puma en la canción Amalia. South of the border, called North America's rubbish dump by Chicanos, Mexicanos congregate in the plazas to talk about the best way to cross. Smugglers, coyotes, pasadores, enganchadores approach these people or are sought out by them. ¿Qué dicen, muchachos? ¿A echársela de mojado? Now, among the alien gods with weapons of magic am I. Navajo protection song sung when going into battle. We have a tradition of migration, a tradition of long walks. Today we are witnessing la migración de los pueblos mexicanos, the return odyssey to the historical mythological Aztlán. This time, the traffic is from south to north. El retorno to the promised land first began with the Indians from the interior of Mexico and the mestizos that came with the conquistadores in the 1500s. Immigration continued in the next 3 centuries, and in this century, it continued with the braceros, who helped to build our railroads and who picked our fruit. Today, thousands of Mexicans are crossing the border legally and illegally. 10 million people without documents have returned to the Southwest. Faceless, nameless, invisible, taunted with "Hey, cucaracho," cockroach, trembling with fear, yet filled with courage, a courage born of desperation. Barefoot and uneducated, Mexicans with hands like boot soles gather at night by the river where two worlds merge, creating what Reagan called a front line, a war zone. The convergence has created a shock culture, a border culture, a third country, a closed country. Without benefit of bridges, the mojados, wetbacks, float on inflatable rafts across El Rio Grande, or wade or swim across naked, clutching their clothes over their heads, holding onto the grass. They pull themselves along the banks with a prayer to Virgen de Guadalupe on their lips. Ay, Virgencita Morena, mi madrecita, dame tu bendición. The Border Patrol hides behind the local McDonald's on the outskirts of Brownsville, Texas, or some other border town. They set traps around the riverbeds beneath the bridge. Hunters in army green uniforms stalk and track these economic refugees by the powerful night vision of electronic sensing devices planted in the ground or mounted on Border Patrol vans. Cornered by flashlights, frisked while their arms stretch over their heads, los mojados are handcuffed, locked in jeeps, and then kicked back across the border. 1 out of every 3 is caught. Some return to enact their rite of passage as many as 3 times a day. Some of those who make it across undetected fall prey to Mexican robbers, such as those in Smuggler's Canyon on the American side of the border, near Tijuana. As refugees in a homeland that does not want them, many find a welcome hand holding out only suffering, pain, and ignoble death. Those who make it past the checking points of the Border Patrol find themselves in the midst of 150 years of racism in Chicano barrios in the Southwest and in big northern cities, living in a no man's borderland, caught between being treated as criminals and being able to eat, between resistance and deportation. The illegal refugees are some of the poorest and the most exploited of any people in the U.S. It is illegal for Mexicans to work without green cards, but big farming combines farm bosses and smugglers who bring them in to make money off the wetbacks' labor. They don't have to pay federal minimum wages or ensure adequate housing or sanitary conditions. The Mexican woman is especially at risk. Often the coyote smuggler doesn't feed her for days or let her go to the bathroom. Often he rapes her or sells her into prostitution. She cannot call on country or state health or economic resources because she doesn't know English and she fears deportation. American employers are quick to take advantage of her helplessness. She can't go home. She's sold her house, her furniture, borrowed from friends in order to pay the coyote, who charges her $4,000 or $5,000 to smuggle her to Chicago. She may work as a live-in maid for white, Chicano, or Latino households for as little as $15 a week, or work in the garment industry, do hotel work. Isolated and worried about her family back home, afraid of getting caught and deported, living with as many as 15 people in one room, the Mexicana suffers serious health problems. Se enferma de los nervios, de alta presión. La mojada, la mujer indocumentada, is doubly threatened in this country. Not only does she have to contend with the sexual violence, but like all women, she's prey to a sense of physical helplessness. As a refugee, she leaves the familiar and safe home ground to venture into unknown and possibly dangerous terrain. This is her home, this thin edge of barbed wire.